Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for an introduction to trauma-informed care. My name is Rachel Jones. I'm with the Division of Behavioral Health. I'm the manager of trauma-informed treatment. And so I do a lot of presentations, consultation, and work on various projects to help advance trauma-informed care. So before we get started into the content, I want to just make one statement about when we talk about trauma-informed care, I like to have honest conversations that matter. And that means that sometimes what you hear can bring up some uncomfortable memories, thoughts, symptoms, feelings. And so in the moment, if that happens to you, rest assured that that is completely normal. That's how your brain processes information and recalls things. But if it feels overwhelming, then do what you need to do to take care of yourself. You may want to distract. You may want to leave for a second and then return, whatever that you need to do to kind of manage that in the moment. And then the other thing that can happen is sometimes that comes up later in the evening or even later in the week when your brain is processing all the information and storing the things that it's heard and learned and thought about. Some of that old stuff can resurface. So I'd just like to put that disclaimer out there before we begin talking about trauma-informed care. All right, I would like to make this as interactive as possible, so I will ask you to use the chat. Let's start with a scaling question. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 is, I don't know much about trauma-informed care, I'm here to learn. And 5 is, I'm an expert and I could probably co-present this with you, Rachel. Where would you say that you land? And if you could just drop that in the chat, 1 to 5, that'll help me get a temperature in the room, if you will. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of 2s and 3s coming through. Great. Thank you so much for that. Okay, lots of 2s and 3s. So you're familiar with some content. You're not yet an expert. Some of you, this might be a lot of new information. I will make my slides available. There's a lot of infographics on my slides that you might be able to use in the future that can be really helpful. I like to begin talking about trauma-informed care by defining the term trauma-informed care. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. Most people, when they think about trauma-informed, they are thinking about services. They're thinking about assessments, screenings, interventions that you would do with a person who has reported that they have experienced a trauma. So it relies on people reporting it being a very clear understanding that someone's got trauma, and then trying to connect them to the appropriate treatment to support them in that journey. Equally important is a trauma-informed approach. This is when organizations begin to shift their culture to provide a supportive environment for their workforce and for the people that they serve by using what they've learned about trauma. So you'll see this reflected in policies, procedures, and practices, and just their daily operations. So the sweet spot when you really have achieved trauma-informed care is where these two things overlap. If you have one, you're halfway there. You're doing great. But you really need two for it to be sustainable and effective, and for your helping professions, the people that you hire, to be able to come to work every day and feel safe and supported enough to also provide that to the people they serve. So when I talk trauma-informed care, I want you to consider both of these elements. Let me show you a really nice infographic. This comes from the Center for Healthcare Strategies. And this highlights what some of those key ingredients are. So there are 10 elements here on the screen. 3 of them speak directly to trauma-informed services. If you look down at the middle, You see treatment planning. You see screening for trauma. And then you'll see using trauma-specific treatment. But those other 7, they're all referring to a trauma-informed approach. And as you can see, it ranges from, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I'm going to mute everyone again. I'm getting people talking over me. Hold on just a moment. All right. Let's continue. So those other 7, as you can see, they range from your leadership having a commitment and communicating that you all are behind trauma-informed care. It looks at how you recruit people to work for you, how you support them when they start working for you and when they continue to do that. How do you ask people with lived experience to contribute back and advise your organization on how you can improve things to be more trauma-informed? How do you prevent secondary trauma? So that's looking at how are the staff experiencing workplace trauma, and are there strategies and things you can do to actually eliminate what that exposure is so that you can retain high-quality staff to keep working? It's also looking at engaging partners. Who are the agencies or the industries that you interact with most, and can you bring them along with you on the journey toward becoming trauma-informed? So this can give us a helpful snapshot of what it would look like when people are really practicing trauma-informed care well. All right, I also like to just expand people's ideas about trauma. Many times when we talk about trauma-informed care, it does rest in mental health or physical health care settings. Most people think of trauma in that way, of how it actually impacts a person's brain and body. But what we know is that trauma also impacts whole communities. So you're looking at all the different sectors within a community that are impacted when trauma is occurring. And then not only are they impacted, but they have a really interesting way that they can contribute to doing trauma-informed care work and helping to build resilient communities and healthy environments so that people can thrive. So I want you to try to take a holistic perspective and just think outside the box today when we're talking about trauma-informed care. I'll dig into another definition, which is defining trauma. I'll be talking about it for the rest of our time together, and so it's kind of helpful to know, what do I mean? This definition comes from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And what I like about this definition is it highlights a couple of points. The first is that a trauma can be an event. It can definitely be something that someone can say, this occurred and that was traumatic for me. But it also can be a set of circumstances that people don't necessarily tie back to a traumatic event. They can't remember when it actually began. They just know that the circumstances threaten them on a day-to-day basis or cause them some physical or emotional harm, and it's a safety issue for them. And another thing I like to point out about this definition is that it goes beyond just impacting their mental health or their physical health. We know it impacts social, emotional, spiritual, financial, even occupational or academic, and people being able to learn and work and thrive. The interesting thing about trauma, though, is that it's a very individualized experience. Two people can be exposed to the same event or circumstances, but have very different outcomes. And that has a lot to do with many factors. Individual, their access to resources, who is in their life that is supportive or not supportive. Those are some of the things that really play into how a person experiences trauma and how they recover from it. I'd like to talk about some examples of how trauma starts to show up in communities. So I'd like for you to look at the screen, and for anyone who's not able to see it, I'll read out some of the examples. Community violence, domestic violence, medical procedures or diagnoses that are life-threatening, refugees and immigration and their experiences, accidents, injuries, war, terrorism and natural disaster, oppression, discrimination, and racism. What most people think about when they think about trauma is the physical, sexual, or verbal abuse and physical or emotional neglect. But other examples are abandonment, separation, divorce even, arrest, incarceration, homelessness, death or loss, poverty and economic hardship, and foster care, or even kinship care when kids are placed with other family members to live. So these are examples of how trauma can be experienced. Some of these are considered private traumas. Those are the most unreported because they are happening behind closed doors, and there's usually secrecy or shame or threats that if someone reports, something bad will happen. But some of these are public traumas. COVID-19 is a pandemic, is an example of a public and collective trauma where people are all experiencing it together at the same time. So it's no secret, and everyone's going through it. Some of these examples are generational, and you see them happen across a family system. Some are considered cultural because they're only happening to certain groups who typically hold less power in society and are marginalized and have fewer rights. And so it's really important to just understand all the different ways and the circumstances that people might experience trauma. When a person has two or more of these, we call that complex trauma. It's different types that are layered on top of each other. And sometimes that can be really difficult for people to know what part of the trauma to address first. Another aspect of talking about trauma-informed care is to talk about system-induced re-traumatization. So this is when systems who are designed to help people aren't taking a trauma-informed approach. And so the decisions that they make inadvertently re-traumatize people. Usually they're trying to manage out of control behavior, or they're trying to focus on compliance and following rules within that organization. And then as a result, they may do these things to people as a way to control that. So it's helpful for us to use a trauma lens, and I'll talk about that a little later, but a trauma lens helps us change the way we ask the question and filter the information differently. And instead of thinking a person's intentionally not following our rules, maybe they are actually responding to a trauma. And so what I do next to support them would be really important so that I'm not making it worse for them. The bottom row is kind of examples of emotional re-traumatization. So it's the way that you would talk to people or talk about them your tone of voice, your word choice, whether you believe them, validate, if you dismiss them. The top row, it's usually referring to policies and procedures and the way that organizations operate daily that sometimes can be adjusted when they put on the trauma-informed care lens. All right, I won't go into great detail today because this is just an hour long, but I do want to just briefly introduce brain science and the science that supports trauma-informed care. Sometimes this is referred to as neuroscience. So it stands for neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. So with neuroscience, this is just how the brain and body respond to stress. And it's us understanding that when a person goes into survival mode, their fight, flight, and freeze response is activated. We need to regulate them first before we can have meaningful interactions and discussions with them. Epigenetics is the study of genes. Genetics and epigenetics help us understand family to family transfer of DNA. So if somebody has a trauma history in their family, the likelihood that that is passed through DNA and expressed in genes is higher. What we know about epigenes are that they can be activated or deactivated depending on the environment. So this is the nature versus nurture debate. Adverse childhood experiences is a study that was done in the mid-90s. If you're familiar with this study, could you put a yes or a no in the chat so that I know how familiar the audience is with the adverse childhood experiences study? Okay, so I'm seeing mixed, about half and half, or yes and no. Okay, so we're going to dig into that just a little bit more, but I do encourage you to look into ACE's study on your own. I think it has the potential to really use a public health model to talk about trauma, and it may change the way you view things pretty significantly. And then the R for near science is resilience. So this is how individuals and communities would bounce back from adversity. And what does it take for us to prepare and buffer against trauma and recover from it? All right, so some high-level concepts for you to understand when it comes to that neuroscience piece and how our brain and body works. Trauma leaves an imprint in both the brain and the body. Your brain cannot tell whether it is a real traumatic experience that you are having or if you are just thinking about it or worried about it. So the brain responds the same either way. It can't tell the difference. And that's important because then what happens is the more we worry about bad things happening or something repeating itself over and over, the more our brain is constantly on alert. And every time we access that stress response in our brain, it's like a muscle that gets worked out. It gets stronger and it gets quicker. And so sometimes we use words like, you are overreacting. Out of nowhere, they just lost it. Those are examples of how the brain's connection is so quick and so strong that that person's stress response gets activated even in situations where they may be safe and okay. Another really interesting thing about the human brain is that the survival brain, fight, flight, freeze, and the thinking brain, rest, relax, and recharge, those two can't happen at the same time. So when we're under stress, the survival brain hijacks the thinking brain. So we got to regulate ourselves, and we have to learn how to regulate other people so that we can get to thinking things through and making rational decisions. Parts of your brain actually go offline whenever you detect a threat. And so that's information for us to know that can help us manage ourselves and other people a lot better when we're experiencing stress. And then, of course, the last concept is the brain remembers things even long after they've passed. So you can get re-triggered. You could have a reminder of something that resurfaces and recalls old thoughts and memories. And that's a natural part of how our brain functions. We also know that the impact of trauma, like I mentioned earlier, it's individualized, but there's also some themes. When people have experienced trauma, you will often see it show up in different areas of functioning and different elements of their health. And so you'll certainly see some brain development changes in young children, but in a lot of cases, you can't tell that there's a brain development issue, maybe until they get a little older. Of course, the cognition, being able to communicate, being able to solve problems in a way that is helpful, being able to learn, those are very impacted by trauma because of what's going on in the brain and parts of the brain that get deactivated at that time. I like to focus on relationships because relationships have the power to heal. People do recover from trauma, and a lot of times it has to do with connecting to a supportive person. Some other ways that people might experience trauma are, of course, their mental health and just anxiety and depression. If you work with children, it's really important to understand developmental trauma as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. So developmental trauma is when traumatic things are happening while that child is young. They may be an infant or a toddler or in elementary school. And so it begins to change the way their brain and body develops, and it looks different. It doesn't always look like PTSD. Sometimes it looks like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. So we call that developmental trauma. And then I also like to hone in on the perception. When a person has experienced trauma, they have the perception that they may not be safe in the world. They may not be able to trust other people, even if those people say that they're here to help. They may have low expectations that anything in their life is going to change for the better. So even if you try to encourage or we try to connect them with services and support, it can be really difficult for them to know how to use that in a meaningful way. All right. I mentioned earlier that I delve into ACEs a little bit more, so we are going to do that. What you see on your screen is called pair of ACEs. So the top part is adverse childhood experiences. So this comes from the study that was done in the mid-90s. It has been replicated for years and years. There's a lot of research and fascinating information about the ACEs study. But it looked at these early childhood adversities that happen before a person turns 18 years old. And so some of it is about them being abused or neglected, but a lot of it is about what they're exposed to in their home environment by the people who are taking care of them. Now, the adverse community events are taking a look at those public and shared trauma experiences that happen to whole groups of people. And this is why I mentioned early on that all sectors in a community need to take part in trauma-informed care work, because people can't expect to be able to thrive and recover if they don't have access to resources that are helpful to them and that are not re-traumatizing. So this model can be really helpful when you're thinking about connecting to community partners and really trying to spread information about trauma-informed care. So what the ACEs study has shown us through all of the longitudinal studies that they've done over time is that the higher the ACE score that a person had prior to age 18, the higher likelihood that they would have these negative health and social outcomes. So as you can see on the screen, some of this has to do with drug use. Some of it is chronic health problems like heart and liver disease, obesity and diabetes. Some of it is about mental health, like depression and suicide attempts, and even completed suicides. And others is about academics and work. Can a person graduate or do they drop out? Are they able to keep a job or do they experience unemployment? Multiple sexual partners and unplanned pregnancies. And we know what the research shows with unplanned pregnancies. When you do not have a plan in place or the resources able to care for a child, you're more likely going to repeat some of the generational trauma that might be happening in your own family system. And then domestic violence, legal problems, and financial problems. So what that research has also shown us is that if you don't put trauma-informed care, interventions, and supports in place for people, and if you don't try to build protective factors to buffer them against trauma, then over time, what the trajectory is that a child would experience a high number of ACEs. It would change the way their brain and body develops. So they may start to have developmental delays in several areas. They may experience social, emotional learning problems. And then they begin to adopt risk-taking behavior to cope with that. And then over time, those can quickly turn into disease or long-term chronic illness and disability and introduce them to other social systems. And that leads to premature death by about 20 years on average. So the trajectory doesn't look good if we don't start doing things in a trauma-informed way. So that's the good news, is that we can stop this trajectory from going this way. Many of those adversities are preventable. And when communities get on board and people start to notice how they connect to trauma-informed care, then we can start changing things so there's a healthier environment. We also know from the research that building protective factors for individuals and families are critical. So no matter what age, people need protective factors in their life to help buffer them against some of those adversities and help them recover quicker. Resilience science also has shown us that there are some ways that you can help people develop resilient skills. Sometimes people already have them. They were born with them perhaps, or it was modeled when they were young, so it's easy for them to access that. But in times of distress, it's very difficult for people to remember to go back to these things that have shown up in the resilience research. So these things like motivation and determination and having a sense of humor and being able to recognize when you've done something really well in the past so you can go back to trying that again, or understanding what you can and can't control, learning how to ask for the help that you need, being optimistic, and being able to set goals. We know that people who have these things are going to be able to bounce back easier. There's also phases that people go through, and beginning kind of with that survival phase, they're just trying to get through an adversity. They eventually learn how to grow through that and they start to thrive. And that's when they really get recovery under their belt. They're adapting and trying new things. They're consistently doing better over time. And eventually they can get into an advocacy role. If they're comfortable and if they're willing, they can share what they've been through and how they got through it with other people who are going through something similar. And that peer-to-peer connection can help other people gain resiliency as well. And then there's community resiliency. And a lot of times people think resiliency is just about individuals making different choices in their life. But we also know that communities need to be safe and healthy. So there are these 4 quadrants. This comes from the International Consortium, and they've done a lot of work on resilience building through organizations or through whole communities. So what you'll see here is, the quality of life quadrant in the green, the responsible governance quadrant in the red. You've got elements of a strong economy in the blue quadrant, and then being prepared, knowing how to pivot and how to respond to traumatic things that happen in the community, and that's in the gold area. And so working all together, building individual resilience and community resilience really helps people recover, but it also over time decreases the amount of trauma exposure people will have. All right, so I want to just kind of do a check. I see in the chat there's some questions. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes, you absolutely can get the slide decks, and I hope you'll use them. All right, I want to turn the corner a bit and start talking about what do we do next. I laid some just basic groundwork for what is trauma-informed care, what trauma looks like in communities, how people can recover, but what do we do with that information? So the next part of our time together today is really just providing you some resources and ideas for ways that you can start using this to change your own personal practices and begin rethinking how your organization functions. So the first thing is to use a trauma-informed lens. And if you're not familiar with that term, those of us who do this work, we talk about a trauma lens quite often. The fundamental part of it is that we need to change the way we ask questions. So we need to move away from looking at deficits and using blaming language, and even looking at diagnoses and limitations. And instead, we need to ask, what happened? Or how can I help? And when we change that and we start asking people what happened, what typically will occur is people will start to explain the trauma events or adversities that they're exposed to, that they are trying to cope with and survive from. And that opens up our eyes to consider other ways of supporting them that will be more effective, because we're getting to the root of what's going on. We're not trying to punish the way they're behaving because of what's going on. Later, we could also consider asking people, once they are in a good place and they have survived those events and they are thriving, like we just saw on that resilience model, we can ask them if they would be willing to share their story. And maybe they can share that with another person to help a person through, but they can also share it with us so that it can change the way we function in our organizations. So we provide better trauma-informed care support to people. Another way that we can get there is to adopt trauma-informed principles. So in theory, this makes total sense. When a person has experienced trauma, these things have either been taken, they were never present, or they were violated. And these principles are what all people need in life so that we can feel safe and secure and we can function to our fullest potential. So everyone on the call today, you need this, I need this, and all the people that you interact with are going to need this too. So you can use these as guideposts to help you make decisions on how you do daily operations. And you can almost just hold this up and say, am I supporting these trauma-informed principles? Or is there something I'm doing that's violating them or dismissing them, or have I not even thought about it? So these can be good conversation starters as people start really trying to move forward with trauma-informed care and move the needle. So safety is about physical, emotional, and cultural safety. And it's about that for your workforce as well as the people that you serve. Trust can only be established if we do what we say we're going to do, and if we honestly address historical mistrust that people have already experienced before they come to us for help. We always want to give people choice and voice. When you don't have a choice in the matter, you have less ownership and motivation, and it feels like people are doing things to you. Collaboration is about a power differential. Can we try to all come together on equal footing? Can we share responsibility in decisions and in credit and giving people credit for the good ideas that they come up with? And then empowerment is about all of us want to be empowered in our life. We want to have some control over something. So this is, how do we help people build empowerment so they don't need us all the time? They're able to step out and feel strong and secure in who they are. So I encourage you to start thinking about these and maybe doing some reflection for yourself and any of the teams that you're connected to in the services that you provide. I use the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration resource quite a bit. They've provided a very in-depth manual for how to become a trauma-informed care organization. And this is one of their takeaways, is that when you're doing this well, you'll notice it because these 4 areas will emerge. And as you can see, it's about realizing how trauma shows up and also knowing how do people recover from it and how could I connect them to that. It's also recognizing what does trauma look like and sound like in other people who I interact with and who interact with our system. And it's about responding in a trauma-informed way. So now that I know it or I'm learning it, how do I need to respond differently? So that usually means you're changing policies, procedures, and practices. And then the last R is about that system-induced re-traumatization that I talked about earlier. It's about recognizing it, questioning it, trying to change it, trying to eliminate it altogether for people who interact with your system and the staff who work within your system. So these also can be a good guide to get conversations started about how do we do this trauma-informed care thing. Earlier, I mentioned that a public health approach is very valuable in doing trauma work. Part of that is because how we know it impacts whole communities. So this is the public health approach that was developed by the Missouri Trauma Roundtable. The technical name, if you want to Google it, it's called Missouri's Comprehensive Public Health Approach to Mitigate the Impact of Trauma. So at the base of this, down where it says health promotion, this is that universal primary prevention where you're trying to educate everyone and give all citizens an opportunity to live to their fullest potential. The next step up is where you're starting to think about reducing potentially traumatic events that people could be exposed to. And what resources would you give people so they could respond quickly and hopefully avoid experiencing that trauma? The next rung up is for people who are at risk of trauma. So then this is looking a little more intensely at preventing and developing negative consequences from those adversities. And then the next rung up is looking at actually needing to use trauma-based approaches with certain people or organizations or groups within a community. So this would look at how your programs are structured, how services are offered to them. And then at the very top, which is a very small fraction of the larger community, you would have people who do need trauma-based treatment because they are experiencing trauma or they've got a history of it. And it's very active and it's a very intensive way of looking at it. So you can use this public health approach to think about how you deliver services in your community, but you can also look at it internally in your organization. So let me give an example. If you work in an organization where there are certain people in certain roles that have more exposure to trauma than other people do, then you can use this and you can support the workforce at these different rungs on the ladder, right? So if you've got certain groups that are going to be exposed to that trauma, then maybe there are workplace interventions you do with them that's a little different than the universal ones you may do with every person who works for your organization. So you can use this a couple different ways, and it can just be helpful to think about ongoing levels of intensity, and not everybody needs the same type of support, but we all need to be looking at it through a trauma lens. Another resource that I find very valuable that if you're not familiar with, I want to encourage you to look it up, is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. This is established by Congress in 2000, so it's 21 years old. National experts, it's the leading voice in all things trauma-informed for children and young adults, which is where a lot of trauma work begins. They have developed many resources and guidance on how to move toward being a trauma-informed system. So these are some of the elements that would be included in that. And as you can see, it's pretty broad. It impacts a lot of aspects of how an organization functions. So you see the policies and definitely screening people for trauma and assessing people and getting them programming, whether that's service or it's education for your staff, but it's that element of here's the actual services that we provide. But then on the right side, you can see some other elements, which is the secondary traumatic stress. So how do you support your management so that they know how to recognize signs and symptoms of a stressed out employee? How do you prevent that and identify it? Also, how do you bring families in? How do you have partnerships with them? How do you use what they've experienced as a way that you can improve your system? They talk about collaboration and doing those cross-system collaborations. And then they also address equity, which is looking at, those disparities that occur because of cultural identification that certain groups have. So this is a really helpful kind of approach, and they've got a lot of great resources on that website, including free webinars. So if you're interested or want to continue to learn on your own about trauma, you can visit that website, set up a free account, and you can access a lot of really high-level, evidence-based information about trauma-informed care. All right, so I have said a lot and I've addressed a lot of concepts and ideas, so I want to try to summarize it in our time together, and then we'll turn it over to any questions that people might have. So first is that trauma-informed care is about services and an approach. It's got to have both those things happening. So it's not just about how you support a person who's told you they have trauma, but it's also how does your organization create a culture that supports it? Also, all sectors in a community are impacted by trauma in some way, and they can contribute in meaningful ways to create healthy environments. When you understand how trauma impacts a person and you use a trauma lens, it can help you make better decisions because you're asking questions different and you're getting different information. And then lastly, there are a ton of resources that can help guide you in your trauma-informed care journey. I've presented a few today that are nationally known and trusted. There's many more. You can easily find some of them, but also I'm a resource for you if you run into problems or need more info. So if you'd like to learn more about trauma, I encourage you to check out our website, dmh.mo.gov/trauma. And you can reach out to me via email, rachel.jones@dmh.mo.gov. So thank you for your time this morning. We do have about 10 minutes. Feel free to leave if you want that time back for yourself, but I can also open it up for any questions through the chat, or you can unmute. All right, I see a lot of people leaving, which is fine. I see some saying thank you and you are welcome. Looks like the dominant question in the chat is, can you get a copy of the slides? And yes, you can. Maybe I will send those to Pat, since she has been my contact person, and then she can send out to the listserv. You can also shoot me an email at rachel.jones@dmh.mo.gov if you want slides that way as well.
Yes, Rachel, this is Pat, and if you want to share them with me, that would be great, and I can post them to the Event Squid website and on our website as well.
Sounds great. Thank you all for your time. Take care of yourselves.